A mountain sits east of Albuquerque, visible from the city's western edge. The U.S. Air Force carved tunnels into that mountain starting in the 1950s, not natural caves, but systematically excavated passageways running more than 10 miles through bedrock, designed to store thermonuclear weapons deep enough to survive a Soviet nuclear strike. Between 2,000 and 4,000 warheads lived inside those vaults at peak capacity, each one kept climate-controlled and secure behind blast doors built to withstand the unthinkable. Most Albuquerque residents had no idea. They lived in the shadow of a weapons fortress, drove past restricted fences, and never knew the exact nature of the mountain that dominated their horizon. But the mountain had a hidden flaw. Water was already leaking through its fractured granite, and the fortress designed to outlast any enemy was being slowly compromised from within. The Cold War would end, the strategy would change, and what was supposed to protect America forever would spend its afterlife being cleaned up by the Environmental Protection Agency, sealed behind fences, monitored indefinitely. General Curtis LeMay believed the Soviet Union would attack. As commander of the Strategic Air Command from 1948 to 1957, LeMay was convinced that American nuclear weapons would not survive a first strike unless they were hardened and hidden deep underground, behind blast doors and redundant security systems. LeMay's philosophy was not a defensive caution. It was a militant certainty. That belief created Manzano. The Manzano Mountains, 20 miles east of Albuquerque, offered granite bedrock, remote access, proximity to Kirtland Air Force Base, existing military rail connections, and a location far enough inland to survive a coastal nuclear strike. Starting in the mid-1950s, the Air Force began excavation. Explosives broke the mountain. Drilling equipment carved tunnels hundreds of feet underground. By the early 1960s, the mountain had been transformed into an underground fortress designed for one purpose: to protect the weapons that protected America. Blast doors sealed the entrances. Climate control systems maintained precise temperature and humidity inside the vaults. Multiple parallel tunnels provided redundancy. No single hit could destroy the whole system. Hundreds of people worked inside Manzano: security personnel, weapons handlers, technicians, officers, and maintenance crews. They arrived before dawn, passed through security gates, descended into the tunnels, and spent their shifts managing weapons that could destroy continents. Secrecy was absolute. Nobody outside needed to know exactly what Manzano contained or how many weapons it held. By the time Manzano reached peak capacity in the early 1960s, it was one of the most important weapons storage facilities in the American arsenal. Strategic Air Command B-52 Strato fortresses stationed at Kirtland Air Force Base, just to the west, would be loaded with warheads from Manzano before deployment. The mountain fed weapons to the bombers. The bombers carried deterrence. The whole system depended on Manzano remaining secure, secret, and operational. Albuquerque was beginning to grow as a military city, employment rising with Kirtland's expanding mission, businesses opening to serve military families, housing developments spreading across the valley, all of it fed by federal defense spending that came with a secret, a mountain full of weapons that most residents did not know existed. But inside that granite fortress, something was already going wrong. The Manzano Mountains are made of granite, but granite has natural fractures and fault lines. Water percolates through fractured rock. The mountain that was supposed to be sealed and dry was allowing groundwater to infiltrate. Weapons vaults require strict environmental control. Water and radioactive weapons materials do not coexist safely. The vaults were designed with climate control and dehumidification systems, but the water pressure from the mountain itself was real. The mountain's greatest advantage, its geological hardness, contained its greatest vulnerability. The same rock that was hard enough to survive a nuclear blast was fractured enough to leak. The mountain had been built as the answer to existential fear, but the mountain's own geology was the trap that would eventually end its mission. The mountain hummed with purpose through the 1960s and into the 1970s. Before sunrise, security-cleared personnel drove through the Manzano area gates, badges checked, names logged, their destinations classified. Shift changes happened in silence. Workers understood that compartmentalization meant you knew only your own small part of the larger mission. Inside the tunnels, weapons handlers moved through the vaults in protective gear, checking seals, monitoring environmental systems, performing routines that had been practiced hundreds of times. A weapons handler might spend 8 hours verifying that a thermonuclear warhead remained secure in its vault, that temperature and humidity stayed within precise parameters, that nothing had shifted or leaked or failed. Then they drove home and said nothing about their day. The work was meticulous, dangerous, and invisible to everyone outside the fence. At Kirtland Air Force Base, Strategic Air Command alert operations maintained constant readiness. B-52 Stratofortresses sat on alert pads, engines ready for quick start, crews standing by, nuclear weapons loaded and waiting. The bombers were the visible face of deterrence, sleek, enormous, capable of reaching Soviet territory from American soil. But their power depended entirely on Manzano. Every day, the integration of the mountain and the aircraft was tested, refined, practiced. If the order came to launch, bombers would scramble from Kirtland, climb toward the sky, and fly toward targets thousands of miles away, carrying weapons that originated in Manzano's sealed vaults. The system worked. It was supposed to work forever. Family housing surrounded Kirtland Air Force Base in geometric rows, hundreds of military homes where officers, enlisted personnel, and their families lived. Children went to base schools. Wives shopped at the commissary. Families attended chapels on Sunday. This was a military ecosystem built on a single mission. Parents knew their lives depended on continued federal spending. The children growing up in those homes had no idea that a mountain to the east contained enough weapons to destroy multiple countries. They played in yards beside fences marked with warning signs. They heard aircraft engines testing. They lived their childhood in the shadow of nuclear weapons without knowing it. The local economy had woven itself entirely around Kirtland and its associated missions. Bars and diners clustered outside the base gate, serving shift workers and off-duty personnel. By the 1960s and 1970s, Albuquerque's population was growing rapidly, from a few 100,000 to 500,000 people or more, and much of that growth was connected to federal military spending. Kirtland employed thousands. Sandia National Laboratories employed thousands more in weapons research and development. The city's identity was fused with national security work. Construction companies, manufacturing firms, and professional services all depended on the base economy continuing to flow. If the mission stopped, the money would stop. The mountain itself remained closed to all but the cleared personnel who worked inside it. Tourists could not visit. Journalists could not enter. Photographers could not document the tunnels or vaults. The fencing around Manzano area was obvious. Chain link barriers with warning signs, guard stations, restricted entry markers. The secrecy was total. The compartmentalization was absolute. The only people who fully understood what Manzano contained were the people who worked there, and they had all taken oaths not to discuss it. But the water problem was growing. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Air Force engineers inside Manzano had documented water infiltration. The mountain's fractured granite was permeable. Groundwater was moving through the rock. Climate control systems were working overtime to manage humidity levels inside the vaults. The problem was contained within security classification, reported internally, addressed through engineering fixes, but never disclosed to the public. Workers at Manzano knew something was wrong with the mountain's geology. They saw the water. They understood, in the compartmentalized way that classified work compartmentalizes understanding, that the fortress had a hidden flaw. The mountain was not as perfectly sealed as the original engineers had promised. The mountain was leaking. By the peak years of the 1970s and 1980s, Manzano area employed an estimated 500 to 2,000 military and civilian personnel. The payroll was enormous, the security apparatus was massive, the infrastructure supporting the mission, housing for personnel, administrative buildings, security systems, transportation, supply lines, rail spurs for weapons transport, communication systems, power generation, all of it had to work flawlessly. An estimated 2,000 to 4,000 warheads sat in the vaults, awaiting the order to deploy that everyone hoped would never come. The deterrent was supposed to work through its very existence. The weapons did not need to be used. They only needed to be there, secure, ready, capable. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty was still decades away. The end of the Cold War was unthinkable. The Soviet Union looked permanent. The threat seemed eternal. The mountain seemed eternal too. No one inside Manzano imagined that the mission would end, that the weapons would be moved out, that the mountain would be sealed, that the workers would be scattered, that the families would move away. Everything suggested permanence. That was the dangerous part. When institutions look permanent, people build their lives around them. The mountain looked permanent. That was the trap. The Cold War ended, and no one at Manzano saw it coming. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Suddenly, the existential threat that had justified building a mountain fortress simply evaporated. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, signed in 1991, began the formal process of reducing American nuclear warheads. START II, signed in 1993, accelerated the reductions. The Pentagon's strategy shifted away from massive centralized weapons storage toward submarine-based deterrence. A submarine carrying weapons was invulnerable to first strike. A mountain full of weapons was vulnerable. The logic that had built Manzano was suddenly obsolete. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, the decision came down. The weapons would be moved. The mission would be downsized. The weapons convoys left. The last warheads were transported out of the vaults. The secure storage mission that had defined Manzano for 40 years was ending. The payroll was disappearing. The jobs that had seemed permanent were evaporating. The mountain was being emptied. In the 1990s, as environmental oversight began to replace Cold War secrecy, the Environmental Protection Agency began investigating military sites. At Manzano, the infiltration problem that had been managed internally for years became impossible to hide. Groundwater testing revealed tritium, radioactive hydrogen used in thermonuclear weapons, in the aquifer beneath and around Manzano. The detection of tritium was a smoking gun. It meant that radioactive contamination from the mountain had entered the water table. The fortress had failed not just operationally, but environmentally. Cleanup was now inevitable. The EPA installed monitoring wells around the Manzano area. Dozens of wells drilled to measure contamination levels and track the tritium plume. The wells became physical markers of failure. Every well was evidence that something had gone wrong inside the mountain, that the secrecy had hidden not just weapons, but also damage. The cleanup timeline became the new mission. Estimates suggested 20 to 50 years or longer. Some areas might never be safe for unrestricted human use. The cost of remediation was potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, money that would come from Air Force environmental budgets, money that would never build new weapons systems. The gates changed, the security perimeter remained, but the reason for the restriction shifted. The mountain was no longer closed because it contained secrets. It was closed because it contained contamination. The warning signs multiplied: high voltage, restricted entry, EPA monitoring zone, environmental hazard. The mountain that had been sealed for national security was now sealed for environmental protection. Albuquerque felt the change slowly. The payroll from Manzano-specific operations declined. Some workers transferred to other Kirtland operations. Some took buyouts and retired. Schools that had been built to serve base families saw enrollment decline. Businesses that had catered to weapons program personnel saw their clientele disappear. The economic integration that had seemed so stable revealed itself to be fragile. The mountain was sealed, tunnels were filled or blocked, certain sections were cordoned off, some areas underwent active remediation, equipment moved through the restricted zone, cleanup machinery, soil testing equipment, groundwater treatment systems. The work was invisible to the public, happening behind fences and warning signs, documented in EPA records that most Albuquerque residents never saw. The mountain that had been the heart of a classified mission was now the center of a classified cleanup project. The secrecy changed form, but it persisted. Veterans who had worked at Manzano began to retire. Some returned to Albuquerque for reunions. They found locked gates, fenced areas, warning signs. The mountain looked the same, granite, visible from the city, part of the landscape. But the mission inside was gone. The people were gone. The secrets were becoming history. Some veterans spoke about their experience in carefully worded terms, respecting decades-old classification, even though the classified work no longer existed. The story of Manzano began to emerge into public knowledge through declassified documents, published histories, and Freedom of Information Act releases. The secret was becoming history. What had been completely hidden during the Cold War became partially visible after it. Not completely transparent, some details remain restricted, some records stay classified, but visible enough that researchers, historians, and journalists could piece together the story of what had happened inside the mountain. Today, Manzano area remains part of Kirtland Air Force Base, but it is not a weapons storage facility anymore. It is an environmental remediation project. The monitoring wells still collect water samples. The cleanup continues. The mountain is visible from the city, but it is functionally invisible, sealed, fenced, undergoing decades-long environmental management. Some areas may never be safe for unrestricted human use. Some contamination may persist indefinitely. Some tunnels may remain sealed forever. The mountain built to survive a nuclear war is spending its afterlife being slowly detoxified from the weapons it held. The opening image remains, a mountain visible from Albuquerque, sealed, fenced, containing vast excavated tunnels and weapons vaults. But it is no longer a secret fortress. It is a geographical fact carrying environmental liability. The mountain that was built to protect America proved unable to protect itself from water seeping through fractured rock, from tritium leaking into the aquifer, from the simple fact that geology does not stay sealed forever. The fortress that was supposed to last eternal is spending an indefinite afterlife in cleanup. The workers are scattered, the families moved on, the secret is becoming history, and the mountain still stands, still visible from the city, still dangerous, still monitored, a reminder that even the most powerful infrastructure is mortal, compromised, and subject to forces far larger than engineering or strategy can control.